Imagine living in a time when your dinner depended on what you could find, grow, or catch. No grocery stores, no takeout, just pure survival. While we argue over the best pizza toppings, medieval peasants were figuring out how to turn tree bark into bread. Their meals weren't fancy, but they were clever. And some of their food hacks? Surprisingly genius. Let's dive into what medieval peasants really ate, and why some of their tricks might still be useful today. Life in medieval times was no picnic. For peasants, getting enough food was a daily battle. They didn't have supermarkets or restaurants. They had to grow, gather, or trade for every meal. And if the harvest failed, tough luck. Hunger was always around the corner. Most peasants lived on small farms, working from sunrise to sunset. Their main crop was grain, usually rye or barley. Wheat was too expensive and saved for the rich. But even the grain they grew wasn't truly theirs. They had to grind it at the Lord's mill and pay a fee. If they tried to do it themselves, they risked harsh punishment. Bread was their number one food, but forget soft, fluffy loaves. Peasant bread was dense, dark, and tough. It was called maslin bread, and made from whatever grains they could find. Sometimes they even mixed in peas, beans, or tree bark. Yes, tree bark. It was heavy enough to be used as a weapon. Seriously, a peasant was once taken to court for assault with a loaf of bread. When times were good, peasants had vegetables from their gardens. Turnips, onions, leeks, and cabbage were common. Potatoes and tomatoes? They didn't exist in Europe yet. Meat was rare because animals were too valuable. Chickens gave eggs, cows gave milk, and pigs were expensive to feed. If a peasant ate meat, it was usually something small, like a rabbit or a hedgehog. Pottage was their go-to meal. It was a thick stew made from whatever was available, vegetables, grains, or old bread. It simmered all day, getting thicker over time. Some families kept the same pot going for weeks, just adding new ingredients each day. It was the medieval version of meal prep. Fishing was a lifesaver, but even that had rules. Lords controlled the best fishing spots. Peasants had to make do with rivers and streams. Eels were everywhere and easy to catch, so they became a peasant staple. Some villages even paid their rent in eels. To catch fish, peasants used nets, baskets, and even drunken bait, fermenting grain to make fish float to the surface. Medieval fishing hacks were wild. Hunting was even trickier. Laws made it illegal for peasants to hunt deer or boar. Those animals belonged to the nobles. If a peasant was caught poaching, they faced serious punishment, even death. But that didn't stop them. They found loopholes, hunting rabbits, squirrels, and even hedgehogs. Protein was protein. Some even purposely got caught poaching in winter because jail meant guaranteed meals. Talk about a risky survival plan. Foraging was another way to find food. Peasants gathered nuts, berries, and edible plants. But they had to be careful. Some plants were poisonous. Medieval people had tricks, like using silver spoons to test mushrooms. If the spoon turned black, the mushrooms were deadly. Not exactly foolproof, but better than nothing. Surviving as a medieval peasant meant being tough, smart, and a little sneaky. Every meal was a challenge, but they made it work. And some of their food hacks? Strangely brilliant. In medieval times, bread wasn't just food, it was life. For peasants, it made up most of their diet. Meat was rare, and vegetables weren't always available. But bread? It was always on the table, even if it was tough and tasteless. Peasants didn't eat the soft, fluffy bread we have today. Their bread was dark, dense, and rough. It was called maslin bread, and made from whatever grains they could find. Rye, barley, oats, sometimes even peas or beans got mixed in. Wheat bread was for the rich. If a peasant got their hands on it, it was a rare treat. Making bread wasn't easy. First, they had to grow the grain. Then they had to grind it into flour. But here's the catch. The lord of the land owned the only mill. Peasants were forced to use it and had to pay a fee. If they tried to grind grain at home, they could get fined or even punished. It was an unfair system, but they had no choice. Once they had flour, they mixed it with water and sometimes a little salt if they could afford it. There was no yeast like we have today. Instead, they used old dough from previous loaves to help the new bread rise. The result? A hard, chewy loaf that lasted a long time. Sometimes it was so tough they had to soak it in soup just to eat it. Bread also played another important role. It was used as a plate. Peasants often ate from a trencher, a thick slice of stale bread. They put their stew or pottage on top, and when they finished the food, they either ate the trencher or gave it to animals. No dishwashing needed. But what happened when food was really scarce? Peasants got creative. Some mixed sawdust or tree bark into their bread to make it last longer. It wasn't tasty, but it kept them alive. Others tried to make bread stretch by adding more water, making it even denser. When famine hit, bread became even more valuable. Prices went up, and many peasants couldn't afford enough. Some even stole bread to survive. If they were caught, punishments were harsh. In some cases, thieves had their hands cut off. Despite its toughness, bread was the heart of the peasant diet. It was cheap, filling, and could be stored for days. Even when times were hard, as long as they had bread, they had a chance to survive. If you were a medieval peasant, chances are you ate pottage almost every single day. It was the go-to meal, cheap to make and easy to cook. Some even called it the never-ending soup because it was always simmering over the fire, with new ingredients thrown in whenever possible. Pottage was a thick stew made from whatever peasants could find. The base was usually water and grains like barley or oats. Vegetables, herbs, and sometimes even weeds were added for flavor. If they were lucky, they might get a bit of onion, garlic, or leeks. But most of the time, it was just a mushy mix of grains and greens. Meat was a rare treat. Peasants couldn't afford to eat it often. If they had access to a little bacon or some fish, they would toss it into the pot. But for the most part, pottage was a vegetarian dish. On special days, maybe a rabbit or a small bird would make its way into the mix. But those were rare occasions. One of the best things about pottage was that it never really ran out. Peasants kept it cooking over the fire for days, even weeks. Every day they added new ingredients to replace what was eaten. This meant the flavor kept changing. Some days it was rich and tasty. Other days it was bland and boring. But no matter what, it was filling. Cooking pottage didn't require much effort. Peasants simply tossed everything into a large pot and let it cook slowly over the fire. This was perfect because they had long hours of work in the fields. By the time they came back home, their meal was ready. It wasn't fancy, but it kept them going. Pottage wasn't just food, it was survival. During harsh winters or poor harvests, peasants relied on it to keep them alive. If there were no fresh ingredients, they used dried peas or old bread to thicken the stew. Some even mixed in tree bark or roots when times were really tough. Even though it was simple, pottage was a part of daily life. Families gathered around the fire to eat from a shared bowl. They dipped their bread into the thick stew, soaking up every bit. It was a warm, comforting meal after a long day of hard labor. For centuries, pottage remained a staple of the peasant diet. It was cheap, easy, and filling. No matter how poor a family was, they always had a pot of pottage simmering on the fire, ready to feed whoever was hungry. Fish was one of the most common foods in medieval times. It was easy to find, quick to cook, and allowed by the church on fasting days. That made it the perfect medieval fast food. People ate fish fresh, dried, salted, or smoked, depending on where they lived and how much money they had. For peasants, fish was a lucky catch. Those who lived near rivers, lakes, or the sea had a better chance of eating it regularly. They fished with simple nets, baskets, or even their bare hands. Some set traps, hoping to catch eels or small fish. If they were lucky, they might pull in a big fish, but most of the time, they had to settle for whatever they could get. Rich people, on the other hand, had a much better selection. Nobles and monks ate large fish like salmon, sturgeon, or pike. They had fish ponds on their land where they raised carp and other fish, ensuring a steady supply. They also had servants to prepare fancy fish dishes with herbs, spices, and sauces. One reason fish was so popular was because of religious rules. The church banned meat on certain days, including Fridays, Lent, and other religious holidays. That meant people had to eat fish instead. Even the poorest peasants tried to find some kind of fish for these days, even if it was just dried herring or salted cod. Preserved fish was a lifesaver. Fresh fish spoiled quickly, so people found ways to make it last longer. They salted fish heavily to dry it out, or they smoked it over a fire. This made it tough and chewy, but it was better than nothing. Traders brought salted fish from the coast to inland towns where it was sold in markets. In cities, fish stalls were common. Vendors sold cooked fish to hungry travelers and workers. It was quick, cheap, and filling, just like modern fast food. Fried fish, grilled eels, or simple fish pies were easy meals for those who didn't have time to cook. Monasteries were some of the biggest fish consumers. Monks followed strict fasting rules and ate fish almost daily. They even had their own fish ponds and kitchens just for preparing seafood. Some monasteries became famous for their fish recipes, cooking up stews, pies, and roasted fish with rich sauces. Fish wasn't always delicious, though. Sometimes the preserved fish was so salty that people had to soak it in water for hours before eating. Poor quality fish could smell awful, especially in summer. But when there were few food options, people ate what they had. Despite the challenges, fish remained a key part of medieval diets. It was cheap, fast to cook, and an easy way to follow religious rules. Whether fresh from the river or dried and salted for the winter, fish was the medieval version of a quick and convenient meal. Hunting in medieval times was not as simple as grabbing a bow and chasing animals. For most people, it was actually illegal. Forests and game animals belonged to the king, nobles, or the church. If a peasant was caught hunting, they could face harsh punishment. Still, many took the risk because fresh meat was a rare treat. The best hunting grounds were protected by strict laws. These areas, called royal forests, were reserved for kings and nobles. Only they could hunt deer, wild boar, and hares. Even owning hunting weapons like bows or traps could get a commoner in trouble. Punishments ranged from heavy fines to losing a hand, or worse. Despite the dangers, some peasants still hunted. They set traps for rabbits or birds in secret. Some used snares or simple bows to catch whatever they could. If caught, they had to claim the animal wandered onto their land, but that excuse didn't always work. Nobles, on the other hand, hunted freely. It was one of their favorite pastimes. They rode horses through the forests, chasing deer with trained dogs. They used falcons to hunt smaller birds. For them, hunting was more than just getting food. It was sport, entertainment, and a sign of power. The bigger the animal they caught, the more respect they earned. Hunting also provided grand feasts. A noble's table might have roasted venison, spiced boar, or stuffed pheasants. These meats were cooked with rich sauces and served in lavish banquets. The best parts of the animal went to the lord's family, while servants and lower-ranking knights got the leftovers. Poaching, hunting illegally, was common despite the risks. Some peasants became skilled at sneaking into the forests at night. They moved quietly, using homemade bows, or even their bare hands to catch small animals. If they were lucky, they could bring home a rabbit or a pheasant without getting caught. In some areas, villagers had limited rights to hunt. They could catch small animals like hedgehogs or birds. Some were allowed to fish in local streams, but these rights were often taken away or restricted further over time. Hunting laws were not just about protecting animals. They were about control. Kings and nobles wanted to remind commoners who held the power. Keeping fresh meat off their plates was one way to do it. If peasants had too much food, they might become too strong or rebellious. Still, hunger often won over fear. A desperate peasant would rather risk punishment than watch their family starve. Some lords looked the other way if the hunting was small and quiet. Others enforced the laws harshly. For the poor, hunting was a crime. For the rich, it was a game. But no matter the laws, people always found ways to survive. Whether through secret snares or noble hunting parties, the forests were always full of those searching for their next meal. Milk, cheese, and butter were important in medieval diets, but not everyone had easy access to them. Cows were expensive, and most peasants could not afford to own one. Instead, many villages had a shared cow. Families took turns milking it, and the dairy products were divided among the people. This was a way to ensure that everyone got at least a little milk, even if it wasn't much. Milk did not stay fresh for long. Without refrigeration, it spoiled quickly, especially in warm weather. Because of this, people often turned milk into cheese or butter. Cheese lasted much longer and could be stored for weeks or even months. Butter was also useful, though it was harder to make without the right equipment. Cheese was a common food for peasants. It was simple to make and could be eaten with bread or added to pottage. Fresh cheese was soft and mild, while aged cheese became harder and stronger in flavor. Peasants mostly made basic cheeses, while monks and wealthy landowners produced richer varieties. Some monasteries became famous for their cheese-making skills. Butter was prized, but not as common. It required a lot of milk, and churning butter by hand took time and effort. Some peasants made small amounts for their own use, but most butter was sold or traded. Nobles and wealthier townspeople used butter more often, especially in cooking. It added flavor to food and made meals feel richer. Other dairy products like cream and curds were enjoyed when available. Cream was rare and mostly used by the upper class. Curds, on the other hand, were more common and could be eaten alone or mixed with other foods. Some people added herbs or honey to make them tastier. The village cow was not just a source of milk. It was also a valuable animal in daily life. It could be used for plowing fields, pulling carts, and even producing manure for crops. Because it was so useful, the village took great care of it. People made sure it was well fed and protected from illness. Sometimes villagers had more than one cow, but they still shared them. If a family was lucky enough to own their own cow, they might sell or trade extra milk and cheese to their neighbors. In some places, goats were used instead of cows. Goats were smaller, easier to feed, and produced milk that was just as useful. Dairy was not just about food, it was about survival. A little bit of milk or cheese could make a big difference in a peasant's diet. It added nutrition and variety to meals that were often simple and repetitive. Even though dairy was not always available in large amounts, it was treasured when it could be found. In medieval times, every drop of milk mattered. Whether from a shared cow, a family goat, or a rare trade, dairy products were a small but important part of life. In medieval times, people did not trust water. It was often dirty and unsafe to drink. Wells, rivers, and ponds could be filled with waste, bacteria, and other dangers. Boiling water helped, but not everyone had time or fuel to do that every day. So instead of water, most people drank ale. Ale was a type of beer, but it was different from the strong brews we have today. It had little to no hops, making it less bitter. More importantly, it was much weaker in alcohol. People drank it all day, even in the morning. It was safe because the brewing process killed harmful germs. Even children drank ale. Since it was mild, it did not make people drunk the way modern alcohol does. It was just part of daily life. Peasants, workers, and even monks relied on it to stay hydrated. For many, ale was the main drink with every meal. Making ale was a common skill, especially for women. Brewing was part of household chores like baking bread or making pottage. Families brewed their own ale at home, using simple ingredients like water, barley, and yeast. The ale was not fancy, but it kept people from getting sick. Villages had ale houses where people could buy and drink together. These were not like modern pubs. They were simple places where travelers and workers could rest. Some people made a living by brewing ale and selling it to neighbors. This was an important job because everyone needed a steady supply. Nobles and wealthier people drank ale too, but they had better options. They could afford imported wines, which were expensive and came from places like France and Spain. Wine was considered a luxury, but ale was for everyone. Even kings drank ale, just better quality than the peasants' version. Monasteries were famous for brewing some of the best ale. Monks perfected brewing techniques and made strong, flavorful drinks. Their ale was often darker, richer, and higher in alcohol. They sold it to raise money for their churches and helped spread better brewing methods across Europe. Sometimes people flavored ale with herbs, honey, or fruit. This added variety and made the drink tastier. Some special ales were made for feasts and celebrations, but for daily drinking, most ale was simple and plain. Water was not completely ignored. People did drink it if they had a clean source, like a fresh spring. Some places built wells to provide safer water, but for most, ale was the safer choice. It was reliable, easy to make, and kept them from getting sick. Drinking ale was not about getting drunk, it was about survival. In a world without clean water, ale was the best way to stay hydrated. It was a part of daily life, from the poorest peasant to the richest lord. In medieval times, there were no supermarkets. People could not just walk into a store and buy food. Instead, many had to find it themselves. This was called foraging. It was like grocery shopping, but in the wild. Forests, fields, and even roadsides were full of useful plants. Peasants gathered nuts, berries, mushrooms, and wild herbs. These added flavor and nutrition to their simple meals. Hazelnuts, walnuts, and chestnuts were common finds. Berries like blackberries and raspberries were a sweet treat. Herbs were very important. People used them to season food and for medicine. Nettles, dandelions, and wild garlic grew everywhere. Some herbs helped with sickness, while others kept food from spoiling. Foraging was not just about eating, it was about survival. Mushrooms were tricky. Some were safe, but others were deadly. People had to learn which ones were good and which ones to avoid. A wrong choice could be fatal. Foragers passed down knowledge from one generation to the next. Foraging was not just for peasants. Even nobles enjoyed gathering food. They picked fresh herbs for their fancy dishes. But peasants needed foraging the most. Their meals were basic, and wild food made a big difference. Rules about foraging depended on the land. Lords owned most forests and fields. Peasants could gather food, but hunting animals was usually forbidden. If caught, they could be punished. Foraging was free, but it was not always easy. Seasons changed what was available. In winter, food was scarce. People dried herbs and stored nuts for colder months. Foraging was a way of life. It provided food, medicine, and variety. It was nature's grocery store, but only for those who knew where to look. Life in medieval times was tough, especially when it came to food. Peasants worked hard just to eat. They relied on simple filling meals like bread and pottage. Hunting was mostly for the rich, and fresh meat was rare. Instead, fish and dairy were important sources of protein. Foraging was a survival skill. People knew how to find nuts, berries, and herbs to add flavor and nutrition to their meals. Drinking ale was safer than water, and food had to be stretched to last as long as possible. Every meal was a struggle, but people found ways to survive. What can we learn from them? First, food was never wasted. Every part of an animal or plant was used. Second, people ate what was available. They relied on seasonal food and preserved what they could. Third, their diet was simple but nutritious. They may not have had much, but they made it work. Today we take food for granted. We have endless options at the store. But medieval people had to think ahead, work hard, and use nature to survive. Their diet may seem basic, but it kept them going. So next time you enjoy a big meal, remember how different things were in the past. Medieval food was about survival, creativity, and making the most of what they had. And maybe, just maybe, we can learn something from their way of life.